Imagine this. You finally settle into your dream home, quiet streets, welcoming neighbors, everything you'd hoped for. Then out of nowhere, the homeowners association decides your water pipeline is an eyesore. Without asking, they storm onto your property, dig it up, and reroute it however they please. Sounds like a joke, right? The kind of ridiculous situation that makes you laugh just to keep from losing your mind. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And no, I didn't just stand by and accept it. By the way, have you ever had to deal with a power-tripping HOA president? Drop your own HOA nightmare story in the comments and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'm Clayton Reeves. I'm 40, work as a water system technician, and value peace, privacy, and doing what's right. I had just moved into what seemed like the ideal neighborhood on the edge of Denver, quiet, tree-lined streets that felt almost like a small town. The house had a good-sized yard, mature landscaping, and what I assumed was a reasonable homeowners association. I should have known that last part was too good to be true. After 20 years of working with water systems, I know how crucial good infrastructure is. What I didn't expect was how someone's oversized ego could turn a simple water line into a personal vendetta. When I was 8, our house went without water for a week. My mom had to haul buckets from the neighbor's place just so we could cook and do laundry. I hated feeling helpless back then. That experience pushed me to learn everything about water systems so nobody around me would go through the same. Before moving here, I'd redesigned a small town's water network in western Colorado, helping them save nearly a third of their costs every year. Water isn't just my job, it's what I care about most. At first, it started with small annoyances. Joyce Halverson, our 55-year-old HOA president, sent passive-aggressive notes about my hedge being too tall, claiming it spoiled the look of the neighborhood. Joyce was the type who measured grass with a ruler and acted like she ran the entire subdivision. After years as a mid-level manager at a real estate company, she seemed to think she was qualified to dictate everyone's landscaping choices. I kept my hedge trimmed and the yard neat, but apparently, that wasn't enough for her. The hedge grew along the easement where my main water line ran from the street to my home, something Joyce saw as a direct challenge to her authority. Whenever I looked at that hedge, I saw something calm and natural, just needing the occasional trim to stay in check. Then came that morning when I woke up to the roar of heavy equipment outside. Half awake and clutching my coffee mug, I stepped out to find workers tearing through my yard with shovels and an excavator. There was Joyce, clipboard in hand, labeled landscape geometry violations, dressed like she was headed to a business lunch rather than a construction site. She directed the workers like a general leading troops into battle. One of the crew, an older guy who looked worn from years on the job, glanced over at me. "Sorry for the mess, buddy. HOA told us your hedge blocks access, so we've got to move your water line." I stood there, barely processing what I was seeing while my flower beds turned to rubble. "Blocks access to what, exactly?" I asked. "Don't know, man," he shrugged. "Lady with the clipboard says move it, so we move it." Looking at the pipes they'd pulled out, it was like staring at twisted wreckage from some plumbing horror show. Bent, rusted, and leaking gilt all over my lawn. I marched over to Joyce, coffee splashing as I tried to keep calm. "Joyce, what is this?" No one even asked before digging up my yard. She gave me the smug smile that makes you clench your fists. "Oh, Clayton, I'm sorry you weren't notified. The HOA has the right to make infrastructure improvements for the community's benefit. Your hedge was creating maintenance issues." My jaw tightened. "Maintenance issues?" "I trim that hedge every month." "And since when does the HOA have the power to reroute a private water line without consent?" Her grin widened like she was enjoying every second. "If you'd read the updated guidelines we sent out, you'd know we have to keep all utility easements accessible." She spoke with the absolute certainty of someone quoting rules they'd never actually read, just betting I hadn't either. By midday, my once beautiful front yard looked like a war zone. My water was completely cut off, and the workers had finished rerouting the main line in a way that left ugly, exposed pipes running awkwardly across my grass like some twisted modern sculpture. When I turned the kitchen faucet, nothing happened, not a drop. I called the HOA office. They put me on hold. When the receptionist finally answered, she told me everything had been handled according to the community standards. I asked when I'd get my water back. She put me on hold again, then returned to say the project manager would get in touch within 3 to 5 business days. Living in a house where every faucet depends on someone else's approval feels fundamentally wrong. I had to buy bottled water for drinking, brushing my teeth, cooking, and washing dishes. Taking a shower meant rigging up a camping setup in my own bathroom. It felt like something out of a dystopian novel, all because Joyce decided my hedge was too offensive for her taste. Seeing those pipes sprawled across the ruined lawn made my blood boil every time I looked outside. This wasn't about water anymore. This was Joyce proving she could do whatever she wanted, and the rest of us had to fall in line. Each morning, staring at what was left of my garden, I remembered my mom carrying those buckets and the promise I'd made to myself that no one should ever live that way again. I had to live without water because someone else decided I didn't deserve it. 2 days later, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal violation notice from the HOA, complete with Joyce's signature and the embossed seal. The letter accused me of landscape maintenance violations and obstructing community infrastructure improvements. But the real kicker was printed at the bottom. All residents are hereby limited to 15 minutes of continuous water usage per session to promote community conservation efforts. I read that line 3 times before it sank in. Joyce wasn't just punishing me anymore, she was coming up with new ways to control everyone's daily life. I stood on my porch, letter in hand, watching rainwater from yesterday's storm snake through the exposed pipes in my yard. The irony wasn't lost on me. More water was running freely across my lawn from the sky than Joyce would allow me to use inside my own home. That night, I sat alone in my dark kitchen, sipping bottled water by the light of my phone's flashlight. The silence felt oppressive, the absence of the fridge's hum and ice maker strangely loud. Joyce had turned what should have been a quiet, ordinary life into something that felt like medieval siege warfare. But as I sat there, something shifted in me. I'd spent my entire career solving water problems, understanding pressure systems, and finding creative solutions to impossible challenges. Joyce might think she'd won, but she'd just picked a fight with the wrong persona, someone who knew exactly how water systems worked and, more importantly, someone who was about to get very creative about fighting back. She had underestimated 2 forces: water pressure and the stubbornness of a man who never forgot hauling buckets alongside his mother. The next morning, I decided to handle it like a civilized adult. I put on my best business casual shirt and drove to the community center for the monthly HOA meeting. I thought that if I could calmly explain what had happened, lay out the facts, and appeal to common sense, maybe we could resolve this without more drama. I should have known better than to expect reason from someone who treats hedge height like a matter of national security. But hope, even against logic, is hard to kill. The meeting room was already full of about 30 residents, many of whom I recognized from quick waves and small talk over the months. Gary O'Connell, who lived 3 houses down, caught my eye and gave a sympathetic nod. Just a few weeks ago, I'd helped him troubleshoot a leaky sprinkler, and we'd joked about how homeownership seemed custom-built to drain both your wallet and your patience. I found a seat in the back row and waited for the community concerns section of the agenda. The room felt sterile, almost like a courtroom without the judge's bench. Joyce opened the meeting with the confident authority of someone who loves being in charge. She waved a laser pointer at satellite photos like she was planning an airstrike on my flower bed. She moved through the agenda: landscaping updates, event planning, a detailed debate about whether the neighborhood's Christmas lights should all be the same color. At one point, an elderly man in the front row shared rainfall measurements he'd apparently submitted to Joyce every week. Finally, she got to community concerns. I stood up and cleared my throat. I'd like to address the recent water line modification that happened on my property without my knowledge or consent, I said. The room fell silent. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Joyce's polite expression vanished almost instantly, replaced by something colder. "Mr. Reeves," she began, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher scolding a disruptive student, "the HOA conducted necessary infrastructure improvements in accordance with community standards. If you have specific concerns, you're welcome to submit them in writing to the board." My carefully prepared speech evaporated. "Joyce, you dug up my yard and shut off my water without notice," I shot back. That's not routine maintenance, that's property damage. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. At least a few people seemed to agree. Joyce, unfazed, clicked her laser pointer and turned back to her slides as if nothing had happened. The HOA has broad authority under our bylaws, she continued. Your hedge had grown high enough to block access to the utility easement. Rather than issue repeated citations, we resolved the issue permanently. She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued in a slow, deliberate tone, as though explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. And regarding the new water conservation rule, it promotes responsible use of our shared resources and helps protect the community as a whole. I forced a smile and said, "Thank you." Outwardly, I stayed calm. But inside, I was already calculating just how far Joyce's bluff could stretch. The longer she talked, the more I realized that logic wouldn't work here. Her statements sounded official enough to convince anyone who didn't look closely. But I had been quietly recording everything on my phone, and some of her answers didn't add up. When I asked which contractor had actually done the digging, she offered only vague references to approved vendors. When I requested documentation proving my hedge truly blocked anything, she pivoted back to broad claims about community standards. Gary raised his hand cautiously. "Joyce," he asked, "shouldn't residents be notified before major work is done on their property?" Joyce's smile tightened by a fraction. "The board has the authority to act swiftly when community standards are at risk," she said. "We can't wait for individual approvals in every case." She said individual approvals like it was some unreasonable demand, like I'd asked to build a nuclear reactor in my backyard. Some residents nodded, relieved it wasn't happening to them, but a few were clearly beginning to question just how far Joyce was willing to go. And as I looked around that room, it became clear, this wasn't just about a hedge or water anymore. It was about how much control Joyce wanted and whether anyone was willing to push back. I left that meeting frustrated but strangely impressed. Joyce had managed to frame her power grab as a matter of community responsibility. Watching her work the room felt like watching a magician's act. You knew you were being misled, but the performance was so seamless you almost admired the craft. But that meeting taught me something important. Joyce wasn't just making random decisions. Every time I pressed her for concrete details, contractors' names, paperwork, project scope, as she slipped into vague statements about community standards and policy compliance. My phone had caught every word of her evasions, and it got me wondering if this was bigger than a hedge dispute. That night, I listened to the recording 3 times. Pausing to jot notes wherever Joyce ducked a question or steered the topic somewhere safer. Her speeches were long, wordy, and polished, ending with a smile that felt less like reassurance and more like a mask. A few days later, another envelope appeared on my door. This one included new community guidelines, all bearing Joyce's signature and the HOA seal, water restrictions, pre-approval requirements for landscaping, and a new clause. All utility modifications had to go through approved community partners. The language was dense enough to numb most people into compliance, but I knew what I was looking at, a bureaucratic smokescreen. And if there's one thing I've learned from 20 years in water systems, it's this: when someone starts changing the rules in the middle of the game, it's rarely about policy, it's about hiding something. So I dug into the HOA bylaws and found Section 5, subsection 12. The transparency clause. Buried in the fine print, it guaranteed homeowners the right to review the HOA's financial records and vendor contracts. Joyce might rule by intimidation, but I could play the paperwork game too, and I'd been studying rulebooks longer than she had. But I also knew I couldn't do this alone. That's when I thought of Rachel Hoy, 35, sharp-eyed, and one of the smartest people I'd ever met in the world of public utilities. We'd crossed paths at a trade conference a few years ago, where she gave a talk on exposing waste in municipal contracts. Rachel had a knack for seeing patterns in numbers most people wouldn't bother reading. If Joyce was hiding something in the books, Rachel would find it. I met Rachel at a cafe copyright downtown. Over coffee, I laid it all out: the unexplained water shut-off, the evasive answers at the meeting, the new rules that seemed tailor-made to protect something. Rachel listened, then closed her laptop for a moment. "Clayton, what you're describing sounds like classic administrative overreach," she said. "But if there's financial funny business, That's usually the real story. Nobody changes the rules this fast unless they're covering tracks. She opened her laptop again as I showed her photos of my torn-up yard and the exposed water line. "Do you have access to the hose records?" she asked. I did, and I had the law on my side. Joyce herself had mentioned the transparency policy. So Rachel and I drafted a formal request, citing the state statute and the hose own bylaws. We kept it polite but firm. We wanted copies of recent financial statements, vendor contracts, and invoices related to the water project. Joyce's reply came quickly and told us everything we needed to know. Instead of sharing the documents, she sent a 3-page letter packed with legal jargon about protecting vendor relationships and avoiding disruption of community operations. In plain English, number. Rachel laughed when she read it. "Nobody writes this much to say no unless they've got something to hide," she said. "It's like sending a love letter to your accountant when you're trying to bury cash under the mattress." That refusal only made us dig harder. Rachel tapped her contacts at the county assessor's office to pull property records, utility permits, and vendor registrations tied to our subdivision. We scoured what was publicly available, and that's when something interesting surfaced. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had paid tens of thousands of dollars to a company called Civic Flow Solutions for infrastructure consulting. It was a lot of money for a small neighborhood that shouldn't have had much infrastructure work beyond routine maintenance. But Civic Flow didn't pass the smell test. When Rachel dug deeper, she discovered the company's registered address was nothing more than a mailbox at a UPS store 15 miles away. Its website was a single page of generic corporate language and no project list. No team BIOS, nothing. When she checked for contractor licenses or state registrations, there was nothing there either. "Clayton," Rachel said, peering over her laptop, "this has Shell Company written all over it. Someone is funneling HOA funds through Civic Flow. The question is who and why." Then came the mistake that cracked the case open. In one contract we pulled from county filings, the company's name was misspelled as Civic Flow Solutions. Rookie error. But it led Rachel to an ownership record that finally named a person, Michael. And just like that, what started as a petty HOA fight over a hedge was unraveling into something that looked a lot like fraud. Halverson, Michael Halverson, Joyce's nephew. Of course, suddenly, it all clicked into place. Joyce had been using her power as HOA president to funnel community money straight to a shell company run by her own family. The endless infrastructure improvements, the new rules, the dodged questions about vendors, everything was part of a scheme to justify payments to Civic Flow Solutions for work that likely never even happened. What I'd thought was petty overreach turned out to be actual fraud. I wasn't just annoyed anymore, I realized my neighbors and I had been robbed. Over the next week, Rachel and I documented everything: Joyce's approvals, the HOA payments, Civic Flow's empty storefront address, and the sloppy contract that misspelled the company's own name. The pattern was clear. Joyce would identify some supposed community need, pay Civic Flow to fix it, and then roll out rule changes to make it look legitimate. My waterline disaster wasn't about hedges, it was just another pretext to get money to her nephew's fake business. It was an embezzlement scheme hiding in plain sight, disguised as community improvements. And while I hated what she was doing, I had to admit it was fraud executed with unnerving precision. But instead of going straight to the authorities, I decided to do something Joyce would never expect. If she wanted to play games with infrastructure, I'd show her what real control looked like. So, I started researching Clearbrook Water, the small utility company supplying our subdivision. If Joyce was manipulating the HOA through fake vendors, what if I could protect the neighborhood by actually owning the pipes themselves? Clearbrook turned out to be a family-run business that had served our area for over 30 years. Its owner, Edward Sterling, was 68, tired of the constant regulation headaches, and rumored to be looking for a buyer. Financial records showed they'd been struggling: aging pipes, compliance costs, and a shrinking customer base. For 20 years, I'd fixed systems other people owned. This was my chance to finally own the system. I remembered my first day as a tech, when a customer threw me out, saying, "What does a technician know about the law?" That memory had fueled me for decades, and now I had the chance to flip the script. I set up a meeting with Sterling. His office was a time capsule of dog-eared maps, dusty file boxes, and the smell of pipe glue and old coffee. Sterling was blunt. "Clayton, this business used to run on common sense and hard work. Now it's all permits, reports, and consultants who charge more than the repairs themselves." He mentioned he'd been approached by bigger buyers, but they only cared about absorbing Clearbrook's assets, not running it responsibly. Then he surprised me. "If you're as good as your RA copyright some A copyright says, point to the 3 weakest points in our network. No software, just you and the map." I studied the decades-old leak detection map, and in about 30 seconds, pointed to 3 spots most prone to pressure failures due to pipe age and elevation. Sterling raised an eyebrow. "2 of those are exactly right, and the third has been giving us headaches for months." That's when I told him my plan. Over the past few weeks, I'd built a detailed business proposal, financial projections, efficiency upgrades, regulatory strategy, everything backed by my savings, business loans, and Rachel's partnership to handle compliance and admin. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not trying to get rich. I want to run this utility right, for the people who depend on it." At first, he was skeptical. But the more we talked, the more my vision resonated. After 6 weeks of negotiations, inspections, and paperwork, while Joyce kept rolling out new community initiatives, Rachel and I quietly finalized the purchase. We didn't tell anyone until every document was signed. For years, I'd fixed broken pipes in hundreds of homes. Now, I'd fixed the water provider itself. The day I took ownership, Sterling handed me the office keys. "Clayton, running a utility is like being married to every customer at ONCIA. They'll all have opinions," he said with a grin. He stayed on as a consultant for the first year, and even seemed relieved to see someone who actually cared about service takeover. Naturally, Joyce found out within days. I was outside replanting the flower beds ruined by her construction crew when she marched over, face set tight. "Clayton, I hear you've purchased Clearbrook Water." "That's a serious conflict of interest regarding your participation in community decisions." Her voice quivered with forced calm, like she was trying to sound in control but knew her scheme was about to blow up. I stood, wiping dirt off my gloves. "Joyce, a conflict of interest is when someone uses their position to benefit themselves, like approving contracts for a company owned by family." Her expression shifted fast to shock, denial, then fear as she realized I knew about Civic Flow. That evening, I sent a letter to every household. I introduced myself as the new owner of Clearbrook Water, explained our plans to modernize and improve service, and announced a comprehensive infrastructure review to make sure everything was done to code. But really, it was a warning shot. Joyce had played her game for years. Now, it was my turn, and I had the pipes to back it up. The letter I sent to every resident explained that Clearbrook Water would be conducting a full review of all water infrastructure to ensure compliance with current safety and efficiency standards. Any water lines modified without proper permits or engineering oversight would need to be brought up to code within 60 days, or service would be suspended until corrections were made. I was no longer just another homeowner fighting nonsense. I now controlled whether the water flowed or didn't. The next morning, I got my answer from Joyce in the form of an angry phone call at 6:30 a.m. "Clayton, this is completely unacceptable," she snapped. "You can't use your position as utility owner to retaliate against legitimate community improvement projects." I let her rant for a couple of minutes, then calmly explained that safety inspections and code compliance weren't retaliation, they were standard operating procedure. "Joyce," I said, "if these infrastructure changes were done properly, with permits and engineering oversight, the inspections will confirm everything's fine. But if corners were cut, it's our duty to fix them before they become real safety hazards." The best part about owning the water company was that everything I was doing wasn't just legal, it was required by state regulations. Joyce had taught me the power of controlling essential services, and now I was using that same lesson in ways she'd never imagined. I thought I had her cornered. We'd documented her embezzlement scheme. The Clearbrook acquisition gave me legitimate authority to inspect the infrastructure, and residents were beginning to question the HOA's finances. But I underestimated Joyce's talent for manipulating public opinion and her willingness to burn someone else to save herself. While I focused on building a factual case, Joyce crafted a story that flipped the entire narrative. It turned out people don't always want facts, they want something to fear. The first sign came when Gary O'Connell knocked on my door holding a stack of professionally printed flyers. The headlines were dramatic: corporate takeover threatens community water supply and local resident becomes monopoly owner. There was even a ridiculous scale model titled Privatized Water Systems at Risk, decorated with miniature flags and arrows like a rogue high school science fair project. Clayton, I don't buy into this, Gary said, but people are getting nervous. Joyce had been going door to door telling everyone I was planning to jack up rates and that I'd forced Clearbrook's previous owner to sell. The flyers were a masterclass in selective outrage. They mentioned my conflict of interest as both a resident and utility owner, but skipped over Joyce funneling home money to her nephew's fake company. They raised fears about corporate control of water, ignoring that I was a neighbor with decades of experience in water systems. Most damaging were the fake quotes from concerned residents worried about service and quality. In less than a week, neighbors who used to wave at me were now avoiding eye contact. Small talk turned into awkward questions about property values and water bills. People I'd helped fix pipes for now looked at me like I'd sold them out. The tension peaked at an emergency home meeting Joyce called. The turnout was double the usual, and Joyce had her scale model displayed front and center. For the next hour, she put on a masterclass in deflection, dodging every question about HOA finances and steering the conversation back to the danger of private utilities. Neighbors who had once trusted me now stared at me with suspicion. I didn't argue, I just took notes, silently collecting every claim and misdirection, because next time, I wouldn't need to speak as the documents would speak for me. I left that meeting feeling defeated. Joyce had turned a conversation about her embezzlement into a debate about me and Clearbrook Water. Residents who'd once supported me now had doubts. People who'd never cared about home meetings were suddenly shouting about community control. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, business plans and financial documents spread out in front of me, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. But as I flipped through the evidence Rachel and I had gathered, the records of Civic Flow Solutions, fake invoices, Joyce's approvals, I remembered something important. The truth doesn't change just because someone tells a better lie. Joyce might have won this round, but the facts were still there. And as I thought about it, I realized she'd actually given me something valuable. She'd shown me exactly how much power came from controlling the narrative via and what happens when someone underestimates the determination of a man who's spent his life making sure water flows where it should. The morning after her propaganda win, I woke up feeling unexpectedly calm. Joyce had shown her hand. She'd attacked me publicly, which meant she was scared enough to take real risks. And in her rush to control the story, she'd made the classic mistake. She believed owning the narrative was the same as controlling the facts. She was about to learn the difference. After spending 2 decades solving complex infrastructure problems, I'd learned that sometimes the best move was to let your opponent's own momentum work against them. Joyce had mastered the illusion of control, but I was the one who actually controlled the Valvesa, and soon, everyone would feel the pressure shift. The morning after Joyce's propaganda blitz at the community meeting, I woke up not feeling defeated, but oddly liberated. Her public attack on my reputation showed just how threatened she really felt, and she'd made a classic mistake, confusing control of the narrative with control of the facts. So I decided to fight back, not with rhetoric, but with the kind of thorough, professional utility management she claimed to support. My first step was sending formal notices to every Clearbrook customer, explaining that we'd be launching a full infrastructure audit to ensure compliance with state safety standards and service reliability requirements. The letters were carefully written, plain, factual, and transparent, making clear that this wasn't retaliation, but standard practice for any responsible utility. Then came the audit itself, and what it uncovered was worse than I'd imagined. 34 safety violations, 16 slow leaks quietly wasting water, entire neighborhoods patched together with expired permits and cheap fixes. Even my own water line, rerouted under Joyce's watch, failed basic standards for pressure management and long-term reliability. We photographed everything, documented every code violation, and assembled detailed engineering reports explaining why these weren't just technicalities, they were real threats to service quality and safety. But the real smoking gun came when Rachel and I matched the HOA's payment records to Civic Flow Solutions with the timeline of these shoddy projects. Every large payment to Joyce's nephew's company was followed by another round of questionable construction, often requiring extra payments for oversight and compliance verification. Over 3 years, the HOA had spent more than $150,000 on work that was not only substandard but outright dangerous. I compiled all of this into a single report: Infrastructure Safety and Financial Transparency, a community assessment. No commentary, no accusations, just numbers, photos of faulty pipes, payment receipts, and Joyce's nephew's signature on every invoice. I hand-delivered copies to every resident. The response was immediate. Within an hour, Gary O'Connell was at my door with questions. Other neighbors called, wanting to know more. By that evening, we had 20 signatures demanding a formal financial audit of the HOA. People could see with their own eyes what had really happened to their community funds. Unlike Joyce's slick flyers and slogans, real evidence didn't need to shout. Joyce tried to regain control, calling another emergency meeting and framing my report as a personal attack. But this time, the mood in the room had shifted. Gary, after reviewing the documents himself, asked direct, pointed questions about how Civic Flow Solutions had been selected and why so many projects had turned out faulty. Joyce had no answers, only excuses. The silence in the room spoke louder than anything else. Residents who had once cheered for Joyce were now openly questioning her judgment. More voices joined in, asking why projects in our subdivision cost more than similar work in nearby communities, and why there was so little documentation to justify the spending. Joyce tried to hide behind procedural rules and vague accusations, but the facts were out, and her credibility was gone. The turning point came when someone asked why Civic Flow Solutions had been paid consulting fees for projects that were later found to violate safety codes. Instead of answering, Joyce tried to blame Clearbrook's previous owner, but Gary pointed out the violations dated back long before my acquisition. I barely needed to say a word. The leaking pipes, fraudulent invoices, and clear timeline of payments spoke for themselves. By the end of the night, a petition was circulating to remove Joyce as HOA president and call for a full audit. It quickly gathered more than enough signatures, and Joyce's support evaporated. But I wasn't content just exposing her mismanagement. Joyce had endangered the entire community for personal gain, and I had both the authority and responsibility to fix it. As the owner of Clearbrook Water, I issued formal notices to every household with connections that failed to meet code, giving them 30 days to correct the issues or face temporary suspension of service. It wasn't about revenge, it was about ensuring the system worked the way it should, and proving to everyone that while Joyce had played politics, I was the one actually doing the job she pretended to care about. And this time, no amount of spin could cover the difference. The cost of these corrections wasn't small, exactly 3 times the normal rate for emergency compliance work. That's standard practice when you're forced to fix safety violations under pressure. Whoever caused the mess ends up feeling the force. The special election to remove Joyce as HOA president was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November, right as the first snow of the season began to fall. I didn't attend, partly because I didn't want to look vindictive, but mostly because I had better things to do, finishing the last phase of my response to Joyce's embezzlement scheme. While Joyce faced the music in a cold community center, I was in the Clearbrook Water office with Rachel, finalizing a new rate structure set to take effect the following month. There was something poetic about it, planning the future of reliable water service while Joyce was finally being held accountable. The new rate plan was simple, completely legal, and fair. Homes with compliant, code-approved water connections would pay slightly reduced rates thanks to improved efficiency. But properties modified without permits or proper oversight, they'd be charged premium rates until brought up to code. For compliant homes, the bill was $80. For Joyce and her shortcut club, $260 plus processing fees for every skipped regulation. It wasn't revenge. It was actuarial math. Properly maintained systems are lower risk, so they get lower rates. Around 9 p.m., Gary called with the election results. Joyce had been removed from office by a margin of more than 4-1. Even some of her old allies had turned against her once the financial truth came out. Gary himself became the new HOA president, joined by 2 residents who'd been strong voices for transparency and proper oversight. "Clayton," Gary said, "the new board's going after full restitution from Joyce and her nephew. We're also tightening procurement procedures so this never happens again." The following Monday, I mailed out the new water bills. Most customers were pleasantly surprised to see lower charges, thanks to streamlined operations and scrapping Joyce's unnecessary fees. But for the handful of homes touched by Civic Flow Solutions shortcuts, the bills were much higher. Joyce herself saw her monthly water bill jump from $87 to $261, reflecting the triple rate plus compliance processing fees. She called, her voice sharp enough to crack pipes. I let her vent, then calmly explained, "This isn't revenge, Joyce. It's regulation with consequences. These rates aren't punitive, they're based on actual risk and the cost of maintaining service to substandard systems. If you want the standard rate again, just hire a licensed contractor and bring your connection up to code." It was satisfying, not because I wanted to see her hurt, but because for the first time, Joyce had to follow the same standards she expected everyone else to ignore for her benefit. The best part? Everything I did was legal and required by good business practice. Utilities must set rates that reflect the true cost of service, including the extra cost of propping up shoddy infrastructure. That Joyce's own actions had created the conditions that justified these rates? Poetic justice at its finest. Over the next few weeks, most affected homeowners chose to upgrade rather than keep paying premium rates. The repairs were handled by licensed contractors who followed code, used proper materials, and pulled the right permits. Everything Joyce's nephew had skipped. After a few months, Joyce's stubbornness ran out. Her quarterly bill passed $700, and she finally caved, hiring contractors to redo her system. The repairs uncovered exactly what I'd expected: substandard pipes, cheap fittings, and no plan for maintenance. Bringing everything up to code cost Joyce over $3,000 from her own pocket. The last chapter came when the state attorney general's office opened an investigation into HOA financial misconduct involving fake vendors. Joyce and her nephew were among the first to face charges in what grew into a broader corruption case. Joyce pleaded guilty to misappropriating community funds and was ordered to pay restitution and perform community service. Her nephew's shell company was dissolved, and he was banned from doing business with any HOA in the state. As for me, I settled into my new role as the owner of Clearbrook Water, running it the way a utility should be run, with transparent pricing, proactive maintenance, and a commitment to treat water as an essential service, not a quick profit center. My own water connection was fixed within a week of Joyce's removal, and my yard slowly recovered from her so-called improvements. I never wanted to be the neighborhood mayor. All I wanted was for residents to know that every time they turned on the faucet, they were being respected. Looking back, the solution turned out to be surprisingly simple once I stopped fighting Joyce on her terms and started using my own expertise. Sometimes the best way to stop someone abusing power is to show what real, responsible power looks like. Joyce thought she could control everything with meetings and manipulation. She played HOA chess. I rerouted the board and let gravity do the rest. If you've ever dealt with someone who tried to push you around because they had a little authority, tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled your own power-hungry bureaucrat. Jastry signing off. But the drama, it never sleeps. Hit that bell if you're ready for the next round.